Welcome to a new video in my home automation series, and today I'm going to talk about something which gets asked a lot in the comments. Whenever I do a video on some ESP devices, whether it's like a commercially available device or something that I build on my own, I get a question of, which ESP framework I should choose, which alternative framework I should, select for my project. And unfortunately or not, there is no one size fits all answer to these, because well, these three things are fairly similar in some respect, but they are also quite different. So I think for each of them, there is usually one or two really good use cases where you should choose either ESP or Tasmota or ESPHome when they excel in one particular feature, well, as far as I'm concerned. So I think, well, as with many things, you really need to understand how you are going to use this device. What is it? What is the device that you're using? What is it that you are trying to get to? And what is the environment that you want to use in? And then based on that, probably I should be able to answer whether either ESP, Tasmota, or ESPHome is the best choice for that particular application. And for this, I've created this selection guide or scoring matrix. Well, I definitely don't want to score it because, as I said, I don't think there is one that would particularly stand out for all the scenarios that I can think of. So this is more like a scoring matrix. And I pick these attributes that I think I'm going to talk through and then basically score these three systems, how they performed in each of these metrics. So I definitely started with ESP, so I think I have the most experience in that one. But I do have a lot of devices that are running on Tasmota because I think in many cases that's just easier to configure. And then lately, when I started looking into Home Assistant, I started looking into ESPHome, and I just realized how easy using that especially with Home Assistant. So I choose to talk about these three. At some point, I think I looked at ESPHome and did a test installation and then looked at how that works, but I never used that later. So I don't know too much about that. Therefore, I'm just going to ignore that from this comparison. And the reason I'm ignoring that because, well, all these things are really evolving. So, I mean, I think I've used each of them, fairly extensively, I would say. But possibly there could be things that I glanced over or things that I didn't think that they are important. But there could be, features in any of these that can be really a niche feature in a specific application. So, of course, if you have any such ideas, just let me know down in the comment section. Maybe I can just summarize them in a pinned comment. So we are going to use this matrix or this table, and I'm already showing you the end result, but I think we are just going to go through this and fill out these manually. So let me just leave this presentation. And of course, if you are interested in any particular area that I'm listing here, I'm just going to have like jump links to that section of the video in the description, and you can also see how the timeline is divided up. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is the hardware support. In the hardware support, I mean like how easy it is to install or customize a particular firmware for a particular hardware. So here, if you remember from the previous one, I think probably the winner is Tasmota because it has these hardware presets. And by hardware presets, I mean that you install the Tasmota firmware, and then, so this is one of my Tasmota devices. It's a Blitzwolf SHP2, which is actually running on this configuration. So if you go into the configuration, then you can configure the module, and then you can select what type of device this is on. So whenever you select any of these presets or modules, basically, then the Tasmota is going to default on which pin the LED is on, which pin the relay is on, which pin one of the sensors on. So it really makes it easy because you install the Tasmota firmware, And then, again, if your module is in the list, you just select that module and you are done. So, well, I mean, pretty much all the configuration is done. You still need to do some configuration, but you don't have to go into the individual things. For example, I always forget where it is. It's not in configure temp, or AI is here. So you can see that you can configure the GPIOs individually. So if you know what is connected to, if there is a button connected to this, or, like button or sensors, relays, PWM, and all the different sensors here, you can do this. But again, if you are using a fixed hardware, you have this template here. And of course, it gets a little bit complicated with ESPHome because you have to go into the devices and you have to configure each of them manually, and you have to know about which pins they are connected to. Which again, it makes sense if you are building something for your own, but if you have a dedicated hardware that you are installing on, which is already supported by Tasmota, it's just really, really easy because it's single click. So this is why I said that you can do. You have this hardware preset, so this is why it's definitely a plus for Tasmota. And on the ESPHome, you can still do pretty much everything, but you have to do it on the UI. But at least you have a UI configuration, so you can click here and say, okay, this is a temperature sensor, this type, it's connected to this pin, and the model is this. And well, this screen is going to change every time you set a different sensor. But as you can see, you have a nice UI where you can configure it. And then probably in this respect is the least, let's say, user-friendly is ESPHome. And of course, there are a lot of examples how you configure a particular sensor, but still you have to muck around with these text files. It has a particular, format that you need to follow, and you have to enter, IDs and stuff, and maybe in some cases reference from one setting to another. I'm not saying it's difficult, but it is definitely not as easy as on the, in the other systems as well. So this is why I said that it's, manual in a YAML configuration file. So I think probably this is the least user-friendly. The next section is integration. And to be honest, I'm going to say that I do have a favorite here, but really you can integrate any of these with I would probably say, any home automation system that you choose. On the ESPHome, well, actually for all of them, you can use MQTT. And I think on the ESPHome, probably MQTT is the best option to choose. And for Tasmota, you also have MQTT, but probably what I would also say that the Tasmota also has a Home Assistant plugin, which is quite easy to use because then you don't have to configure anything because Home Assistant is just going to find you all the Tasmota devices. And then probably the same is true for the ESPHome. So it has a Home Assistant plugin, and actually that plugin is the reason that I started using ESPHome. So I've just shown you how you are editing the YAML file, but still, I mean, the whole configuration is in in Home Assistant, where you would do all your home automation configuration. So it is very well integrated. You don't have to use another program or download an additional software. And you can do the over-the-air update. You can just initiate here. So if you make any changes here, you can recompile the code for your ESP device and you can just upload it here. So it is very well managed in the ESPHome. If you are not using ESPHome, probably it is, it's a slightly bit more difficult. I mean, of course, for each of them, you do have the option to compile your own binaries, but I mean, if you are going down that route, then probably you can just choose any of the systems because, well, you can do that thing in each of them. So, especially if you are using Home Assistant, I would say that you either use Tasmota, especially if you are using an available hardware, because then you have these pros, which I just talked about, and but equally there is ESPHome with a plugin, so that's also easy to use. And then if you're using something else, for example, I'm using mostly Node-RED, then I can just use MQTT and ESPHome works just as easily with MQTT as anything else. So in the controller, I can create a new controller, and as you can see, it supports quite a few different ones, but I mean, it's mainly, either HTTP or MQTT protocol. So it says Home Assistant or OpenHub or Node here. So you configure your MQTT details here, and then you can configure the sort of the other device, how it receives and interprets that data. So that would be all about the integration. The next thing is over-the-air update. And well, there is no difference in these because all of these three systems support over-the-air update. But I think I just wanted to include this because I think many people would like to have this functionality. To be honest, this is something that I'm not really using, or I would say probably not using at all. I do use it on ESPHome because that's the only way to upload a new firmware. It doesn't have its own website or UI, but you can initiate firmware update from any of the other UIs. So for example, this is how the the Tasmota looks like, and if you go back to the main menu, you can do a firmware upgrade from here, and then the URL is pre-populated, so you can just click on start. On the ESP, maybe it is a slightly less user-friendly because you just have a firmware update function here, and then you have to just download your binary first and then upload it here. Yeah, so you just choose the file here. So I would say it is equally easy. The main thing is that, let's say you choose either ESPHome, ESP, or your Tasmota, and then you build your final hardware, and maybe it's up in the attic, it's behind your wall switch. If you need to update the firmware, you can just do it over the air. You don't have to take the device out and plug it into the USB. So all three of the systems supports that. The next one is the post setup config. So in post setup, I mean that obviously you either buy a Sonoff or a Blitzwolf device that you want to flash, or you just have a bare, ESP module, and you flash the ESP firmware, and how you do the setup of that device after you have gone through the initial setup. I mean, for each of them, first you have to set up your Wi-Fi account, but after the Wi-Fi account, you have to do some other stuff. And I think definitely the easiest one is ESP, because as we could see, there is a full UI, so you can do the configuration here. We could see how you can add controllers, how you can add the hardware, how you can, sorry, that's the hardware, how you can configure the various pins, how those pins are used. You can configure the devices, or like the sensors and the relays, the buttons that are connected to it. You can also configure rules from here. So if you want to use some built-in logic, you can configure it, or you can basically script it here on the UI. And you also have a lot of other features here under tools. So I think this is probably anything that you want to do in ESP, there is a UI already built into the firmware, so you can just do it. I think for Tasmota, it is a slightly bit worse, because you still have a lot of menus. So you do have configuration. You can configure what type of module it is, a Wi-Fi configuration, the MQTT, and some logging. But then if you want to do anything extra, then you have to come to the console and you just have to type commands. So anything which is more than the basic configuration, you have to use the console commands. And there is a very good documentation of what you can do. And if I start scrolling down, you can see this list is huge. So I mean, you can pretty much do anything here. It's just that you have to look up these things, and some of them have parameters as well, and then you have to come to the console. Sorry, not this one. You have to come to the console and you have to type it. I wouldn't say it's less intuitive. I can understand the difference between, because if you build a UI for something, that takes up space in the code, that takes up space in the firmware, and these devices have limited memory. So if you can make your UI smaller, you can squeeze more functionality into the actual code. And to be honest, you are only doing the well, hopefully you are doing the configuration once. So you spend the time to look up the commands, you type them in, and then, if you're not really changing the device, you don't have to touch it. So this is why I would say that definitely the standout framework is the ESP. And on the Tasmota, you have the console commands. And well, I'm not even going to show you ESP because just like with the the hardware support, we have seen that anything that you want to use, you have to configure in the configuration YAML, and that's exactly the same with the post config. So if I go into my ESPHome, you can see that, well, once I do the initial setup, I have to configure what are the sensors are connected to it. Maybe that sensor also requires some code, some logic, like this lambda function, that I have to put that in. Maybe I need to change like the update interval. I again need to just manually type the number into the appropriate place. And nothing wrong with this. It's just a different way of getting to the same end result. The next option that I could think of is the local logic. And I think that gets ignored quite a lot. But I have done quite a few different videos where I stress the importance of the local logic, because these ESP devices are actually quite capable. I mean, the framework itself, which is running on them, even though it doesn't really look like it, it is doing a lot of stuff. It's, monitoring Wi-Fi. If it's connected to MQTT, it is constantly monitoring MQTT connection, making sure that it's connected. If it disconnects, then it reconnects again. It does all sorts of logging and, monitoring the devices, the looking, checking memory and that sort of stuff. But there is still a lot that you can do on the ESP. And again, I think when it comes to the local logic, the best one is ESP, because you have a rules engine with a full editor or a full UI editor. And this was something that I've already glanced over. So if you go into the rules, you can edit the rules in here. And as I said, it gets overlooked a lot because I would assume that a lot of people just, create the ESP Easy firmware or the Tasmota firmware, and they would try to implement most of the logic either in, let's say Home Assistant or in Node-RED. I would say there is nothing wrong with that, but then, that logic works as long as the Wi-Fi connection is up and your Node-RED or Home Assistant is running. But I would argue that probably there is a lot of functioning that you can do on the ESP itself. So you don't have to, rely on yet another system to make it work. Very easy example. For example, I have this, ESP connected. Sorry, I have this ESP where this ESP Easy is running, and that has a relay, and then it has a button. So now I created a rule which says that, if I push this button, then the relay gets turned on. So I have a local switch to do that. I mean, if I don't create this rule, then what I could do is I can program the ESP, which I probably have done in the, so I programmed it, the input switch as a device, which then sends a message, for example, an MQTT message that I pick up in Node-RED, and I send the signal to, turn on the relay, which is absolutely fine. But again, let's say if my Node-RED is done, that button is not going to do anything. And I think one of the best example for this is a video that I done probably about a year ago, where I had an ESP module with an OLED screen that I connected a temperature sensor and a relay to it. And well, these 3 things or 4 things basically is what you need in a thermostat. And I was able to use ESP Easy with some rules and then configuration to turn it into a fully working thermostat. So you could set the set temperature on the device, and it would monitor the temperature using the temperature sensor, and it can turn the relay on and off without any additional system. So it was like a standalone unit which was working as long as the unit was receiving power. So it wasn't relying on anything else. And this is why I think the local logic could be a really important thing. And especially if you're playing around with some sort of like prototype project, having a UI editor, it just makes it really easy because you can see what's going on. You can just easily, make changes to the code and then you save it. So this is why I said it's a definite plus for ESP Easy. Well, Tasmota is not a lot behind because it also has rules but these rules are in the commands. So if you want to create rules in Tasmota, it works pretty much like ESPHome. Probably the syntax is a little bit different, but then you just have to put your rules in here into the command, which is, again, it finds, it works, but then you don't have an editor. So if you want to get what rules that you have selected, you have to query here. You're going to see the rule here in the log, which will scroll, slowly scroll up as you have more messages coming in. So, it works. It's just not as user-friendly or easy to use as ESPHome. And in ESPHome, I would say that you still have rules, but probably a little bit more limiting than the rules that you find in ESPHome or Tasmota. For example, here I have this test sensor that I done in ESPHome, and it has a motion sensor connected to it, and it also has an LED. And as you can see, I could program a simple local logic which says that if the not the light, sorry, I just need to find, no, that's the binary sensor, this is the radar sensor. So I was able to create this logic which says that if the on press event is triggered on the radar sensor, which, I mean, this radar sensor pretty much works as a push button. So let's say if I push the button, then I turn the light on. So with this event, I could reference to the light, which I have configured here. And I said that, okay, if motion is detected, turn that light on with 100% brightness and 100% red, because this is like a color LED. And then when the on release, so this is when no motion is detected anymore, then it's just going to turn off the light. So this is again a simple automation or a simple local logic, but it's just not as powerful as I think it's not as powerful as what you can do in ESPHome, or sorry, Tasmota or ESPHome. Or for example, there is a lambda function that you can put in any sensors. So with these lambda functions, you can do calculations like one of your sensors is returning temperature in Celsius, so you can convert it to Fahrenheit within ESPHome, so you don't have to do it anywhere else. Or let's say you are measuring voltage and current, and you can just multiply the two, and that's how you can generate another value, which is the power. So there are options here, but I think there are probably better options in ESPHome. And again, I've done a whole video on ESPHome rules many years ago, and they still apply to ESPHome. So with that, my verdict for ESPHome is, well, I said very minimal. So that definitely ESPHome is the winner here. Flashing, maybe this is something that I could have put in the past because that's what you are going to use the first, but I thought this is probably the least, well, one of the least important ones. And especially because, again, all three systems pretty much behave the same way in these. Back in the past, in a couple of years ago, flashing any of these systems was a little bit more complicated, but now each of the systems come with an own flasher. So for ESPHome, there is an ESPHome flasher. For Tasmota, there is a Tasmotizer, a program called a Tasmotizer. And for ESPHome, well, as I said, there is this very wonderful plugin for Home Assistant. And with these two, the ESPHome flasher and the Tasmotizer, you have to go to GitHub, and then you have to download the latest binaries, and then you just have a very easy, let's say, Windows or macOS application where you connect the device to the USB, and then you select the bin file, and you click a button, and then basically just wait for a couple of minutes, and it's going to be done. So this is the, the first time install of the firmware that you need to do on the ESP, and then once you have done that, then you don't have to look back at all, because later on you can use the OTA. So that's really good. The next one I want to talk about is local control, which is very similar to local logic, but local control means that can you use the built-in UI or the ESP itself to, interact with the device? And I think in that, maybe you could guess that the ESP is the best. This is something that I actually covered in a separate video, that you can also build a custom UI on the ESP itself. So again, I have this test hardware, which has an ESP and it has some sensors connected to it. And I have built this very simple website, which is actually running on the ESP itself. So again, if you need a very, very simple project where you only use an ESP and you are not going to integrate it with Home Assistant or Node-RED or anything else, you just want that device to perform a function that you can access over your local network. So let's say, this device is hidden somewhere or in the shed or doing something in your garden where you still have, internet connection. You can build a self-sustaining system where it's going to generate its own website where you can check the readings, you can toggle the relay, you can get some feedback statuses on the output, and well, you can just build it in HTML and still rely on the ESP to do the rest of the integration. So it is still going to be less work than to write the home firmware in yourself in Arduino or in Platform.io. So I think this is a really, really good feature. I was really happy that I was able to come to this fairly simple but very effective project. But again, I would say that probably this is the one that is going to be used less by anyone. So this is a very nice feature, but I think it's a very niche feature that very few people are going to use. On the Tasmota, you have basic controls of the device. So, many times I get asked like how I can have a simple button on my ESP. Like, for example, you have the Tasmota, you configure that this is a Son of Basic or like a Blitzwolf SHP2, then Tasmota already knows that it has an output. So it places this simple button here and you can toggle it from here, from the UI. ESP doesn't really get that easy because it's very universal. So it doesn't have just a simple button on the UI. But on the other hand, this is not something that you would be able to build in Tasmota. And when it comes to ESPHome, the only UI you have is your Home Assistant. And to be honest, ESPHome was designed, I think, primarily to be integrated with something else. So it doesn't have its own website. It doesn't have its own configuration screen, because you do all the configuration here in the YAML file, and then it generates the code which gets uploaded to the ESP just to perform that function. So it's not going to provide you with the UI or anything else. You just create it, and then you're going to use Home Assistant to map the values. So for example, this is, actually it is not turned on, but you don't need the ESPHome to do the UI, because you are going to use all the UI features of, let's say, Home Assistant to, let's say, display the readings of the temperature sensors and the motion sensor. So I think was built for a different reason. Therefore, it doesn't really perform very well in this regards. But still, you can, I've looked up the documentation, and you can actually configure ESPHome just to generate you a very basic UI if that's what you need. And the last two things I want to talk about is the community and the documentation. And I would say that I wouldn't blame any of these systems for not having a good community and a good documentation. Maybe Tasmota is a little bit better. It has a more active online forum and community, but that's again just my personal. This is how I feel. Maybe somebody would have a different experience using each of these firmwares and talking to guys who support them. And I think the documentation is excellent for all of these. I've already shown you the all this Tasmota documentation on what sort of commands it supports and modules. And the same applies to ESP. So I'm using the ESP command reference a lot just to understand what are the commands that are supported, because those are usually the comments or the commands that can be used in the rules as well. And the ESPHome has a similar website where you get a lot of info how you can configure the YAML file. So if, let's say, you want an ESPHome and you need a DHT22 temperature and humidity sensor, you can just look for that and you click, and then it says, oh yeah, this is how the unit looks like. And finally I'm going to have this UI on my Home Assistant, and all I need to do is to put this into my YAML file. So it is not that difficult. And with this, we reach the end of this matrix. There is one more thing which is more like, a technical difference between these systems that I didn't put in any of these categories. I just want to talk about it. Is when you use ESPHome or when you use Tasmota, then you download a binary. I mean, of course, you can build your own binaries, but I think like 99% of the people are just going to download one of the binaries from the GitHub, and then you're going to install that in ESP. And that means that all the features that you need is in the binary, and then you're putting it on the ESP, and these are the features that you can use. And in most cases, this is all fine. But I think there are specific cases where the hardware actually has a limitation on the ESPHome or on Tasmota. So, for example, if you are using a Sonoff Basic or any of the the Sonoff based commercially available hardware, so ESP based commercially available hardware, so Sonoff or Blitzwolf, they have an ESP which comes with a 1 megabyte flash ESP chip. So the memory inside is very limited. So again, what can be included in the code is also very limited. And also keep in mind that if you ever want to use over-the-air update, it means that your firmware can only be half the size of your memory. Because let's say you have 1 megabyte of memory, you can only use a firmware which is up to half a meg, because then the other half of meg of memory is going to be used to download the firmware too. So of course you will be limited by how big firmware you can use. I think Tasmota have some tricks how you can go around this by first flashing to a very small firmware, which is, let's say, 120K. So then the next one that it can download can be, well, almost 1 meg, or I don't know, like 850K. And the reason I'm explaining all these because as we start introducing more and more sensors, the code for all of these sensors and the logic and everything has to be included in the firmware. So I think with ESPs and also with Tasmota, we reach a limit where they have to pick something which is most widely used. So there could be some special sensor that could be supported by ESPHome, but it just doesn't fit in the firmware, or not in the size of the firmware which you can upload into certain devices. If you're using a Vmos D1 Mini or a Node MCU, they usually have a 4 megabyte memory, so then you have better options. And this is why you would see in ESPHome that they have a lot of different firmwares for different sizes. So I'm not sure if I would be able to find the download link, but if I do, then I'm going to show you. Actually, let me just quickly find it in my computer. So ESPHome, and if I load the ESPHome flasher, so this is the application where you can flash the ESPHome, then you will see that there are so many different versions of the firmware. You can see that there is normal versions for a 4 megabyte ESP, you have 1 megabyte ESP, and well, there are some hardware specific versions as well, and that's the reason behind it. And you have pretty much the same thing with Tasmota as well. The way ESPHome is different is that when you use ESPHome in the plugin, where is my Home Assistant? Yeah, so you create your YAML file, and then obviously in your YAML file you say that, okay, for this device, I want to use this sensor and these relays and these functions and, this logic. And then based on this YAML file, you actually compile a specific firmware for that ESP. And that specific firmware is only going to contain the code which is required based on the YAML file. So if you are only using 2 sensors, the code is going to be much less because it's not going to include the code for all the other sensors that Tasmota and ESPZ includes. At the end, it doesn't really make any difference for you. That just makes it easier to deploy and over-the-air update ESPHome on smaller devices, because let's say if you're using a Sonoff Basic, it doesn't actually have any sensors. It just have some button inputs and then a relay output. So the ESPHome firmware for that Sonoff Basic is going to be much smaller than the ESPs and a Tasmota, which is going to bring in a lot of functionality that you are never going to use because, well, it's a simple hardware. So that's the reason you have all these different bin files for ESPZ and Tasmota, and this is why you don't have any of these in ESPHome. This is just a different way how these firmwares were built and designed. So after watching this video, I hope you have a better understanding how ESPZ, Tasmota and ESPHome differs from each other. If I need to draw a conclusion, I would say that I would use ESPZ if I need to create a custom device. So most probably if I do like a VMOS D1 Mini or a Node MCU and I start connecting sensors and relays to it, and especially if I want to use local logic, so if I want to use rules, then I think that's the easiest one to use in ESPZ. And also if you want to use this local control, which I would again say that this is a very nice but probably a very niche application. So that's the use case for ESPZ. For Tasmota, I would definitely use Tasmota whenever I need to flash a commercially available device. Like if I get a Sonoff Basic and I just want to get rid of the Sonoff firmware, I want to flash it, I would most probably flash it with Tasmota and not with ESPZ, just because of the the different module definitions that it has. It's just so easy to just flash it, change the module definition, and you are pretty much done. It doesn't get any easier than that. And when it comes to ESPHome, I would use ESPHome over ESPEasy if I want to integrate it, especially with Home Assistant, because as I said, the Home Assistant plugin is absolutely brilliant. It's done so nicely and it makes the whole, firmware flashing effortless. I mean, you have to deal with the YAML file, that's the only downside, but everything else is a plus. And of course, that also means that if you are creating a custom device, something that you are wiring up yourself, it is still much easier to do it in ESPHome if you end up integrating it with Home Assistant anyway. So if you're using in standalone or maybe just Node-RED, you don't need the integration, maybe I would use ESPEasy. So, definitely if you have a fixed hardware, probably Tasmota, and if you are building something on your own, if you are using Home Assistant, I would say ESPHome. If it's more like a standalone or, I don't know, integrated to Node-RED with MQTT, and then I would maybe use ESPEasy. So this is my main framework, how I choose an ESP firmware for any given project. I hope you found this video useful. Thanks for watching, and hopefully see you in the next video.